Dr Strangelove is Stanley Kubrick's other science fiction film, not counting A Clockwork Orange. In it, a science fiction device, the Doomsday Machine, is accidentally activated when a deranged US Air Force general sends his bomber aircraft to attack the Soviet Union. Despite desperate efforts to turn the planes around, one of them still gets through.
The film is a chilling reminder of the absurdity of mutually assured destruction, carried to its logical but preposterous conclusion. It is also a masterpiece of comic timing and tight script writing, heightened by Peter Sellers' hilarious ad-libs and delightful one-liners.
But how accurate is it? The film is based on the book Red Alert by Peter George, a former senior officer in the Royal Air Force. He was concerned about the lack of control over nuclear weapons in the US military. Officially, use of these devices could only be sanctioned by the President. However, by the late 50s, effective control was in the hands of fairly junior commanders. George speculated what would happen if somebody tried to start an unauthorized war. Kubrick's genius was to turn George's somber book into the most absurd black comedy.
The film depicts a large force of nuclear-armed B-52 aircraft on airborne alert, positioned around the Soviet Union. From 1960 to 1968, there was indeed an airborne alert of planes flying in racetrack circuits near to the edge of Soviet air defence. Operation Chrome Dome was to enable the retaliation in the event of a surprise attack on bomber and missile bases. In fact, only 4 or 5 planes were airborne at any one time, each carrying 4 3-megaton thermonuclear weapons. The operation required complex rendezvous techniques with refuelling tankers. Several fatal collisions, all involving the loss of nuclear bombs, curtailed this plan. Once past their fail-safe points, or go-no-go points in official parlance, the individual aircraft had a suite of electronic defences to protect themselves. The primary means of confusing radar tracking was jamming. The standard air defence at this time was the SA-2 Guideline surface-to-air missile, officially the S-75 Divina. It was relatively easy to outwit, providing the bomber stayed low, performed evasive manoeuvres, and jammed the tracking radar, the equivalent of shining a powerful searchlight to blind the detector. However, a sufficiently well-trained and determined missile crew could see through the jamming and successfully detonate a missile close enough to inflict damage by shrapnel. Crucially for the story, the encrypted radio receiver on Slim Pickens' bomber was damaged by such shrapnel. In fact, there wasn't actually such a thing as a CRM-114 discriminator, but if there was, it would have probably worked on the same principle as a squelch circuit. The idea would be that any radio signal would pass through a series of transistors and would filter out any noise unless a particular high-frequency signal tweaked the system into receiving an input. 3 such transistorized filters would be used. These could be tuned to different frequencies. Only when all 3 signals are sent in the correct order would the system operate. To avoid the receiver falling into Soviet hands, it was equipped with a self-destruct system, which unfortunately destroyed the device before the bomber's recall code was transmitted.
But what of the Doomsday device, the machine that would trigger itself automatically and poison the Earth? Incredibly, there really was such a concept. It was imagined by Leo Szilard in 1950.
Szilard was one of those rare geniuses whose quick mind imagined almost everything to do with nuclear power. He invented the concept of a nuclear explosion by neutron chain reaction. He devised both the uranium graphite reactor and the plutonium fast breeder reactor. He was, in short, the most inventive scientist that most people had never heard of. His idea was deceptively simple. Realizing that nuclear reactions create an abundance of neutrons, they can be utilized to create radioactive elements. It might be worth a quick recap here on nuclear fission, fusion, and radioactivity. Most chemical elements have a very stable arrangement of neutrons and protons in their nucleus. Usually they're arranged in equal numbers of each. Radioactive elements, or radioisotopes, have unequal numbers and are geometrically unhappy. Of course, atomic nuclei don't really look like this. This is just a graphic representation. The unhappy nuclei try to rearrange themselves by throwing out bits and pieces, with a helium nucleus here, an electron there. It's impossible to say when this will happen for any given atom, but all radioactive isotopes will decay at a constant rate for that specific isotope. Within a certain time, half the isotope will have decayed into some other element. This is called a half-life. Some are measured in nanoseconds, some in billions of years. The larger the nucleus, the more unstable and chaotic it becomes. Some of the heavier elements have a strange trick. They can cleave in half. Uranium falls into 2 lighter nuclei and 3 stray neutrons. This process is called fission. The 3 neutrons whiz off, perhaps colliding with other uranium nuclei, causing them in turn to fission. This was Szilard's chain reaction realization leading to the atomic bomb. This process also generates an enormous amount of energy, generally gamma and X-rays. This can be used to squash lighter elements together, fusion, generating even more heat and spare neutrons. The so-called hydrogen bomb actually uses heavier materials such as lithium, deuterium and tritium. The extra neutrons are eventually used to spark an additional fission reaction, adding to the explosive yield of the bomb. However, Szilard's idea was to use them to make radioactive cobalt. This would be vaporized in the explosion, condense in the stratosphere to drift on the winds and fall thousands of kilometers away. Cobalt-60 has a half-life of 5.67 years, long enough to cause lasting damage to anyone or anything in the fallout. Direct radiation sickness will occur from breathing or ingesting the dust. This is a disease that destroys rapidly dividing cells, causing vomiting, diarrhea, hair loss, skin rashes, and eventually death as the immune system and various organs collapse. Even if the population takes shelter, there will still be disastrous effects to agriculture. Many species in the ecosystem utilize cobalt, most notably the bacteria that fix nitrogen in the soil. Even if the cobalt doesn't kill bacteria and plants outright, the cumulative concentration will build up and kill people. Cobalt isn't directly used in human metabolism, but is found in vitamin B12, crucial for blood synthesis and neurological function. The effect on civilization would be dramatic. In the film, Ambassador de Sadesky states that the bombs have been jacketed in cobalt thorium G, which he mispronounces as cobalt thorium G, like the computer language.
De Sadesky is a diplomat and not a scientist, so the error is excusable. Scientific scripts are often like acting in a foreign language, without any conceptual translation. Actor Peter Bull invented a much more manageable phrase. However, he states that it has a half-life of 93 years. Try as I might, I was unable to work out exactly what isotope of thorium might have been used to make this mixture, or how it might have been produced. Szilard chose cobalt-60 deliberately, as it was a useful compromise between longevity and radioactivity. Long hard lives are generally rather pointless, since they're not really all that radioactive. Atoms only collapse occasionally. Cobalt thorium G, it seems, is merely an invention of Kubrick and George. Working through the likely numbers of neutrons released from each explosion, we arrive at a figure of around 7 to 21 tons of cobalt-60, a fairly modest amount for such a large device, but enough to cause a lot of trouble. The Doomsday device is located on Jokrov Island. A 5,000 megaton explosion in the Arctic Sea would cause considerable melting of sea ice and would inject a large amount of material into the stratosphere. This would include radioactive steam, fission and fusion decay products, and quite a lot of Jokrov Island. The polar vortex would push this material westwards to Alaska and Canada before looping back through northern Europe and Russia. It would slowly spread southwards and fall out across the northern hemisphere. A fine dust of cobalt-60 and other microscopic particles would remain aloft for many months, maybe years, before slowly falling to Earth, crossing over the intertropical convergence zone and poisoning the southern hemisphere. How long would they have to stay down their mine shafts? De Sadesky is completely wrong to suggest that the Doomsday Shroud would circle the Earth for 93 years. He hasn't understood how fallout or half-lives work. Using the average figure of 14 tons of cobalt, distributed mostly in the northern hemisphere, then probably about 25 years should be safe, about a quarter of Dr Strangelove's estimate. The damage to the collective ecosystem would be quite profound at this time, although it is unlikely to be as dead as the moon, as de Sadesky says. Finally, the Doomsday Machine's triggering mechanism was a computer system linked to various detectors watching for nuclear explosions. This system was an automated and irrevocable decision-making process which rules out human meddling. It's quite touching how much faith was put into the idea of computers in the 1960s. In practice, however, mistakes in the software or bugs were likely to either explode the device or cause the system to fail rather often. Mechanical failures were all too frequent, particularly in Soviet design systems, which lagged behind those of the West, and they were bad enough. This was a theme Kubrick would explore further in his next film, 2001: A Space Odyssey. So, should we stop worrying and learn to love the bomb in this 60-year-old Cold War comedy? Well, unfortunately not. The whole point of Szilard's invention wasn't a practical suggestion, but a means to scare people into realizing how dangerous nuclear proliferation and stockpiling really was. The Soviet Union did finally develop a wannabe Doomsday Machine, a semi-automated missile launch system that combined the machine with Wing Attack Plan R.
Systema Perimeter was operational from 1985, and in true Strangelovian style, they neglected to tell the Americans about it until 1993.
Nuclear weapons are still with us, and with little to stop expansionist policies in former communist countries, the risk of an AI-mediated accidental nuclear war remains a distinct possibility. Hopefully, the appalling images of the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki will remain in politicians' heads long enough to avert disaster. Thanks for watching. May we prevail in peace and freedom from fear, and in true health for the purity and essence of our natural fluids.